and I think it's insulting that you are trying to test my knowledge of economics and the decisions that this president has made.
That's Karoline Leavitt losing it live on TV. But what triggered the outburst? Well, Jimmy Kimmel mocked her marriage in front of millions.
Karoline Leavitt, she's married to a much older real estate magnate, which, you know, in that case, you're hired.
And just when you thought it was over, Jim Carrey jumped in later, fueling the fire.
She knew. She knew.
She knew. Yeah, Karoline clearly didn't take that well. She's going full bananas, and now everyone's talking about it. Let me fill you in. The crazy clash. Imagine a world where the youngest White House press secretary in history finds herself in the crosshairs of late-night comedy's most notorious hosts. That's exactly where Karoline Leavitt, the 27-year-old political firebrand turned Trump spokesperson, found herself when Jimmy Kimmel decided to take aim at both her marriage and her role in the administration. It all started on January 28, 2025, during Kimmel's monologue on Jimmy Kimmel Live. The late-night host didn't hold back when discussing Leavitt, comparing her to Trump's former press secretary Sean Spicer, and mocking her for repeating what he called false claims about the administration's handling of California wildfires. Kimmel highlighted Leavitt's statement that the U.S. military turned on the water to address wildfires, comparing it to Spicer's infamous false claim about Trump's inauguration crowd size. Viewers could practically feel the tension building as Kimmel's audience roared with laughter at the expense of the young press secretary. But that was just the opening salvo in what would become a brewing war between Leavitt and late-night television. The real explosion came when Kimmel decided to get personal.
She's married to a much older real estate magnate, which, you know, in that case, you're hired.
That's right. Kimmel didn't just criticize Leavitt's professional performance. He went straight for her personal life, explicitly implying that her marriage to Nicholas Riccio, a 59-year-old real estate magnate, might have influenced her appointment as press secretary. The 32-year age gap between Leavitt and her husband had become fair game in the increasingly brutal world of political comedy. But the criticism didn't stop there. As if sensing blood in the water, the hosts of The View piled on the very next day. Whoopi Goldberg was visibly fuming during the January 29th episode, taking particular issue with Leavitt's comments about wokeness during her debut press briefing.
I would like this young lady this is her first job, I would like her to do a little homework. Because she said something yesterday that really pissed me off. And that was, she said, there will be no wokeness here.
Oh, yeah.
Let me explain something to you. Because without that wokeness, you might not have that job.
Goldberg's rant continued, emphasizing how wokeness was essential for historical equality, allowing women and black people access to opportunities. The veteran television host wasn't subtle about her feelings, saying Leavitt had really pissed her off with the anti-woke rhetoric during her White House briefing. And then there was Joy Behar, who took an even more controversial approach by suggesting Leavitt was hired based on her appearance rather than her qualifications.
I think she's probably been put in there because, according to Donald Trump, she's a 10. You know that's what it is.
This comment drew immediate backlash online, with many accusing Behar of the very thing The View hosts claim to fight against, undermining a woman's professional achievements. Online commentators were quick to point out the hypocrisy, with one noting how strange it was coming from Behar, who is as woke as they come and positions herself as a champion of feminism. But what was the reality behind these heated exchanges? Was Leavitt truly pissed, as headlines suggested? And where does Jim Carrey fit into this political circus? Although Carrey didn't directly attack Leavitt himself, he's been one of Hollywood's most savage critics of the Trump administration. From 2017 to 2021, Carrey unleashed a brutal series of political cartoons targeting Trump and his allies, calling Trump a melanoma and the administration raping our system. His artwork depicted Trump as the Wicked Witch of the West, with Paul Ryan and Devin Nunes as flying monkeys, and showed Trump and Rudy Giuliani as torch-bearing vampires, going lower than any administration in history.
Trump is toast.
The comedian turned political activist even created a monstrous portrait of former press secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders, describing her as someone whose only purpose in life is to lie for the wicked. This vicious assault on Trump's previous spokespeople set the stage for how Hollywood would treat Leavitt.
This is Robert Mueller.
Robert Mueller putting the squeeze on the president. Just to relieve the stress.
Carrey didn't stop there. During a 2018 appearance on Real Time with Bill Maher, he likened Trump to a used car salesman and urged Democrats to embrace socialism, praising Canada's healthcare system while attacking Republicans. He even wore Nike sneakers as a deliberate salute to Colin Kaepernick, signaling his alignment with social justice movements opposed to Trump's agenda. It's all part of a well-orchestrated Hollywood campaign that seamlessly transitions from one Trump spokesperson to the next. The tactics don't change, only the targets do. And with Kimmel and The View leading the charge against Leavitt, the entertainment industry's war on the Trump administration continues unabated, gaining steam with each passing controversy. The reality is far less dramatic than the YouTube thumbnails would have you believe, but it does represent something far more significant: the increasing polarization of American media and the use of personal attacks in political discourse. As we watch this political dumpster fire unfold, it's worth noting that Leavitt's path to becoming press secretary wasn't exactly a straight line. Before taking on the role of White House spokesperson, she worked as an assistant press secretary under Kayleigh McEnany in 2019, later becoming communications director for Representative Elise Stefanik, RNY. She also ran unsuccessfully for Congress in New Hampshire's 1st District in 2022, losing to Democrat Chris Pappas. Her appointment as White House press secretary in 2025 made her the youngest person ever to hold the position, surpassing the record previously held by Ronald Ziegler during the Nixon administration. This historic achievement, however, has been overshadowed by controversy and criticism from left-leaning media outlets. Despite the provocative commentary from Kimmel and The View hosts, Leavitt addressed the mockery calmly in an interview on The Megyn Kelly Show. During this conversation, she openly discussed her relationship with Riccio, acknowledging that their significant age gap was indeed unusual. When asked if she had any reservations about dating someone much older, Leavitt simply replied, "Yes, of course." She then added, "I mean, it's very atypical love story, but he's incredible. He's my greatest supporter. He's my best friend. He's my rock." Rather than lashing out at her critics, Leavitt chose to humanize herself and her relationship, explaining how she met Riccio during her congressional campaign through a mutual friend who hosted an event at a restaurant he owned in New Hampshire. It appears that, at least in this instance, the reality was far less explosive than the clickbait would have you believe. But that doesn't mean the story ends there. The media machine. As the dust settled from the initial salvos fired by Kimmel and The View, a larger battle was brewing between Karoline Leavitt and what the Trump administration perceives as the hostile media establishment. This wasn't just about personal jabs at her marriage, it was about a fundamental clash of worldviews that would define Leavitt's approach to her role as press secretary. The tension was on full display during Leavitt's press briefings, where she didn't shy away from confrontation with journalists. In fact, a compilation of her most contentious moments reveals a press secretary who seems almost eager to go toe-to-toe with the press corps.
And I think it's insulting that you are trying to test my knowledge of economics and the decisions that this president has made. I'm now regret giving a question to the Associated Press. It's not up to you. You're not the president, Gabe. Are my press briefings not good enough for you, Jackie?
These weren't isolated incidents. They represent a consistent approach that Leavitt has taken since assuming her role: combative, defensive, and openly skeptical of the mainstream media's motives. It's a stark contrast to the traditional relationship between press secretaries and journalists, which, while often tense, typically maintained a veneer of professional respect. But Leavitt's approach shouldn't come as a surprise when you consider the broader context of the Trump administration's relationship with the media. Throughout both his first term and his 2024 campaign, Trump consistently vilified what he called fake news and the enemy of the people, setting the stage for the confrontational stance his press secretary would later adopt. This antagonistic relationship reached a new level when, on February 25, 2025, Leavitt announced significant changes to the White House press pool, taking control away from the White House Correspondents Association, WHCA, and giving the administration the power to determine which outlets would be granted access. The move was justified as an effort to end the monopoly of DC-based journalists over press access and include new media outlets like streaming services and podcasts.
Yeah, absolutely, Sean. And it's because President Trump has revolutionized media and the way Americans consume media. He started this on the campaign when he opened the campaign to social media influencers and podcasters, and he was willing to take that non-traditional media route.
This wasn't just a policy change. It was a declaration of war against the traditional media establishment. Leavitt even went so far as to place mugshots of criminals on the White House lawn, forcing reporters to confront stories they'd rather ignore.
And we have continued that effort at the White House. And it's sad, truly, that we have to put mugshots of illegal alien criminals on the front lawn of the White House in order for the mainstream media to actually cover these stories. They should be covering them, but because they do not, we will put them right in their faces.
While defending these changes, Leavitt insisted they weren't about ideology, but about reflecting modern media consumption habits. However, the White House Correspondents Association saw it differently, viewing the move as an unprecedented attack on press independence. This battle wasn't limited to formal press briefings. Leavitt also took to social media to challenge what she perceived as biased reporting, such as when she criticized The Washington Post over a report that attempted to tie Trump to racism. Her aggressive defense of the administration earned her her praise from supporters who saw her as standing firm against media bias, while critics viewed it as part of a concerning strategy to delegitimize journalism. Against this backdrop, the jokes and criticisms from Kimmel and The View take on a different significance. They're not just personal attacks. They're part of a broader cultural and political divide that Leavitt finds herself at the center of. But what about Leavitt's own statements that sparked such controversy in the first place? During her first White House press briefing on January 28, 2025, she made comments about wokeness that would later be seized on by her critics.
It means no more funding for illegal DEI programs. It means no more funding for the Green New scam that has cost American taxpayers tens of billions of dollars. It means no more funding for transgenderism and wokeness across our federal bureaucracy and agencies.
These statements, part of a broader discussion about a federal funding freeze, reflected the administration's commitment to rolling back what it considers unnecessary or wasteful government spending. But to critics like Goldberg, they represented an attack on progress and inclusion. The conflict was further inflamed when Leavitt defended what many considered to be hardline immigration policies, offering no apologies for the administration's approach.
All of them, because they illegally broke our nation's laws and therefore they are criminals as far as this administration goes.
This exchange, which conservatives saw as a masterclass in handling hostile questions, further cemented Leavitt's reputation as a fierce defender of Trump's policies, willing to take on all comers in the media arena. But as the months wore on, a sense of desperation began to creep into Leavitt's media performances. In a recent appearance on Fox News that can only be described as a flop, she struggled to defend the administration's increasingly bizarre policy proposals, like slapping tariffs on Hollywood films.
The trade deals are continuing to move along in a positive and productive direction. The Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Commerce, the President himself continue to be engaged on this every single day, keeping in mind the American worker and reshoring jobs here at home. You had a new announcement from the President yesterday, tariffs on the film industry.
It's a proposal so nonsensical that even sympathetic analysts were left scratching their heads. How exactly would tariffs on American film production help the economy? It's the kind of policy that reveals an administration flailing for solutions as public opinion turns against them. Even more absurd was Leavitt's defense of Trump's plan to reopen Alcatraz, a historic landmark that has been closed as a prison for decades, as part of his law and order agenda.
Great to see you, Sean. Thank you so much. And this is a phenomenal idea by President Trump that will be executed upon. In fact, I can confirm for you that the White House has already administered calls with the Bureau of Prisons, our counterparts at the Department of Justice, and our counterparts at the Department of Interior, because Alcatraz is now run by the National Park Service.
The proposal ignores basic realities. Alcatraz would require millions in renovations. Federal prisons already have excess capacity, and the logistics of operating a prison on an island make little practical sense. But for Leavitt, no Trump idea is too absurd to defend. What makes this ongoing tension particularly fascinating is that it's playing out at a time when the relationship between politics and entertainment has become increasingly blurred. Late-night hosts like Kimmel have become more overtly political, while political figures often employ the tactics of entertainers to communicate their messages. In this environment, Leavitt's marriage became just another piece of ammunition in the culture war, with critics using it to question her qualifications and supporters pointing to such attacks as evidence of liberal hypocrisy. The personal had become thoroughly political. But while social media erupted with claims of lawsuits and explosive confrontations, the reality was much more measured. There's no evidence that Leavitt directly addressed The View or Kimmel in her official capacity, suggesting a strategic decision to focus on her duties rather than engage in public feuds. This doesn't mean she avoided the topic entirely. In a December 2024 interview on Fox News, before the Kimmel and The View controversies erupted, Leavitt had already dismissed the show's hosts as out of touch with reality, after they suggested that Elon Musk and JD Vance were planning to take power from Trump. This indicates pre-existing tensions that would only escalate in the months to come. The conflict between Leavitt and the media represents something larger than personal disagreements or political posturing. It's a manifestation of the deep polarization in American society, where even basic facts are contested and every statement becomes a potential battleground. As press secretary, Leavitt finds herself at the front lines of this cultural war, tasked with defending not just the president's policies, but his entire worldview against what many on the right perceive as a hostile media ecosystem. Her approach, confrontational, unapologetic, and deeply skeptical of mainstream narratives, reflects the Trump administration's broader communication strategy. But there's another aspect to this story that hasn't received as much attention: the actual policies being implemented by the administration that Leavitt defends so fiercely. Beyond the personal attacks and media battles, there are real-world consequences to the decisions being made in the White House, particularly when it comes to the controversial Project 2025. As we'll see in the next section, the conflict between Leavitt and her media critics isn't just about personalities or political theater, it's about fundamentally different visions for America's future. And as press secretary, Leavitt has become one of the most visible champions of a conservative agenda that aims to reshape the federal government in ways ways that progressives find deeply alarming. The policies behind the personality. Behind the theater of press briefings and late-night mockery lies something far more consequential, the actual policies being implemented by the Trump administration. As press secretary, Karoline Leavitt isn't just defending herself against personal attacks. She's the public face of a comprehensive conservative agenda aimed at restructuring the federal government. At the heart of this agenda is Project 2025, a detailed blueprint developed by the Heritage Foundation and over 100 conservative organizations. Published in April 2023, this 920-page document offers specific policy proposals for every major federal agency, serving as a roadmap for conservative governance. Leavitt's controversial comments about wokeness weren't just throwaway lines or personal opinions. They were reflections of this broader policy direction. The administration's moves to cut funding for what Leavitt called illegal DEI programs and transgenderism and wokeness directly align with Project 2025's goals of eliminating what it considers wasteful or ideologically driven spending. But what exactly does Project 2025 entail? The initiative is structured around 4 main pillars: a detailed policy agenda, a personnel database to identify conservatives for government roles, training programs, and a 180-day playbook for rapid implementation of conservative reforms. In the education sector alone, the proposals are sweeping and controversial. They include eliminating the Department of Education, shifting policymaking to state and local levels, promoting education savings accounts that would allow families to use public funds for private education, and blocking what conservatives call gender ideology and critical race theory in schools. Critics argue that these policies would devastate public education, potentially affecting millions of students. The National Education Association warns that Project 2025 would gut federal education funding, sanction discrimination against LGBTQ+ students, divert taxpayer funds to private schools, and codify classroom censorship. But education is just one aspect of this comprehensive agenda. Project 2025 also calls for securing the border and completing Trump's wall, increasing oversight of agencies like the FBI and DOJ, unleashing American energy production by rolling back environmental regulations and cutting government spending to reduce inflation. This isn't just theoretical. Since returning to office, Trump has nominated several Project 2025 authors to key positions, and many of his initial executive orders mirror the plan's proposals. On January 20th, 2025, he signed Executive Order 14151 aimed at terminating DEI initiatives within federal agencies. Just 9 days later, he ordered agencies to shut down programs that promote or reflect gender ideology. These actions represent a dramatic shift in federal policy, one that Leavitt is tasked with explaining and defending to an often skeptical press corps. And it's in this context that her confrontational approach makes strategic sense. When you're implementing policies that fundamentally challenge progressive orthodoxies, there's little to be gained from trying to appease critics who fundamentally disagree with your worldview. The media battles we've witnessed, from Kimmel's jokes to The View's criticisms, aren't just about personality or presentation. They're proxy wars in a larger battle over America's direction. When Whoopi Goldberg lambasts Leavitt for rejecting wokeness, she's not just critiquing a turn of phrase. She's defending a progressive understanding of social justice that Project 2025 explicitly rejects. Similarly, when Leavitt changes White House press pool rules to include more conservative media outlets, she's not just being petty. She's implementing a deliberate strategy to bypass traditional gatekeepers and speak directly to the administration's base. This approach aligns perfectly with Trump's long-standing media strategy, which prioritizes direct communication with supporters over attempting to win over skeptical mainstream journalists. The personal attacks on Leavitt, particularly regarding her marriage, take on a different significance in this light. They can be seen as attempts to undermine her credibility as she advocates for controversial policies. By focusing on her age or suggesting she was hired for her appearance, critics can avoid engaging with the substance of the administration's agenda. This dynamic was evident during Leavitt's first press briefing, where she didn't just defend specific policies, but articulated a broader vision of governmental transformation.
While I vow to provide the truth from this podium, we ask that all of you in this room hold yourselves to that same standard. We know for a fact there have been lies that have been pushed by many legacy media outlets in this country about this president, about his family, and we will not accept that.
This wasn't just tough talk from a new press secretary. It was a declaration that the administration sees itself as engaged in a struggle against entrenched interests, with the media as a primary opponent rather than a neutral observer. In this worldview, Kimmel and The View aren't just entertainers offering commentary. They're part of a larger system working to undermine conservative governance. Of course, defenders of the administration would argue that this confrontational stance is justified by years of what they perceive as unfair treatment by mainstream media outlets. They point to the disproportionate negative coverage of Trump compared to his predecessors, and the occasional factual errors or misleading framing in reporting on the administration. Critics, meanwhile, contend that the hostility toward the press is part of a broader authoritarian tendency aimed at delegitimizing any source of information that doesn't align with the administration's administration's narrative. They see Leavitt's combative approach not as a justified response to bias, but as an attempt to avoid accountability. The truth, as usual, likely lies somewhere in between. Media bias is real and documentable, but so is the administration's tendency to label any negative coverage, however factual, as fake news. Leavitt, as press secretary, has the unenviable task of navigating this contentious landscape while advancing her boss's agenda. What's clear is that the conflicts we've witnessed, whether in press briefings, late-night monologues, or daytime talk shows, aren't just about personalities or pettiness. They're manifestations of a deeply divided political culture where fundamental questions about America's identity and future are being contested daily. In this environment, Leavitt's marriage, Kimmel's jokes, and Goldberg's rants are all just surface manifestations of deeper conflicts that will continue to shape American politics long after the current news cycle has moved on. The real story isn't about who went bananas or who slammed whom. It's about competing visions for the country and the increasingly bitter battle to determine which will prevail. As the youngest press secretary in history, Karoline Leavitt has been thrust into this maelstrom of controversy and confrontation. Her handling of these challenges, sometimes combative, sometimes measured, reflects the complexity of her role as the public face of a deeply controversial administration. Whether you see her as a brave defender of conservative principles standing firm against a hostile media establishment or as an aggressive mouthpiece for regressive policies depends largely on your own political perspective. But what's undeniable is that she has become a central figure in the ongoing American political drama, navigating personal attacks and policy disputes with a confidence that belies her youth. In the end, the story of Karoline Leavitt, Jimmy Kimmel, Jim Carrey, and The View isn't just about a feud between political figures and entertainers. It's about a nation grappling with fundamental questions of values, power, and identity. Questions that won't be resolved by a press briefing or a late-night monologue, but will continue to shape American politics for years to come. Peace out. Thanks for listening. Click on the box on the screen to watch other stimulating content.
Let me be clear, there will be no unilateral reduction in tariffs against China. The president has made it clear.
Karoline Leavitt's recent live interview was nothing short of a tragedy. It went off the rails almost instantly. She tried to outsmart the media, but instead ended up completely embarrassing herself on a national stage. From what most consider to be inaccurate claims during a White House briefing, to desperate attempts to spin the narrative, she practically handed her critics all the ammunition they needed. Today we're breaking down exactly how it all unraveled, and why it's exploding across the headlines. The rise of controversy. In the turbulent landscape of American politics, few figures have emerged as quickly and controversially as Karoline Leavitt. Today, we're examining a situation that has captivated political commentators and everyday Americans alike. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt's recent press appearance that many are describing as nothing short of catastrophic. As the youngest press secretary in American history at just 27 years old, Leavitt has been a lightning rod for both admiration and scrutiny since assuming her role in January 2025. Before we dissect the disaster that unfolded, it's essential to understand the figure at the center of this political storm. Karoline Leavitt rose quickly through Republican ranks, working in the first Trump administration before an unsuccessful congressional run in New Hampshire in 2022. Despite that electoral defeat, her unwavering loyalty to former President Trump secured her a position in his 2024 campaign and ultimately the prestigious role of White House press secretary. Her rapid ascent has been remarkable, from a small-town New Hampshire upbringing to one of the most visible positions in American politics. Leavitt's communication style has been characterized by a combative approach toward traditional media outlets since day one. In her very first briefing on January 28, 2025, she set a confrontational tone, declaring that Americans' trust in mass media has fallen to a record low and emphasizing the inclusion of what she termed new media, podcasters, influencers, and conservative outlets that might be more sympathetic to the administration's messaging. This strategic shift was immediately evident when she called on Axios's Mike Allen and Breitbart's Matt Boyle before legacy outlets like the Associated Press, breaking decades of protocol and signaling a new era in White House communications. The message was clear. The traditional press would no longer be given the deference they'd grown accustomed to over generations. But what exactly happened during the briefing that has everyone talking? Let's examine the pivotal moments that transformed a routine press conference into what critics are calling a complete meltdown. The controversy centers around what has become known as the Signalgate scandal, a significant security breach where top Trump administration officials accidentally included The Atlantic's editor-in-chief Jeffrey Goldberg in a Signal group chat discussing sensitive military strike plans against the Houthis in Yemen. The leaked messages, published by The Atlantic, revealed conversations about potential military operations, creating a firestorm of questions about the administration's information security protocols. On March 26, 2025, Leavitt held what would become an infamous press conference lasting less than 25 minutes. She began by speaking for under 10 minutes before taking questions that quickly centered on the leaked war plans. From the outset, her defensive posture was evident as she dismissed the Atlantic story as sensationalized and accused Goldberg of being an anti-Trump hater and a registered Democrat. What followed was a masterclass in how not to handle a crisis. Leavitt claimed no classified information had been leaked and that National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, who had inadvertently added Goldberg to the chat, had taken responsibility. She mentioned an investigation was underway but provided virtually no specifics, a response that journalists found woefully inadequate given the gravity of the situation. The tension in the room escalated dramatically when CNN's Caitlin Collins attempted to probe deeper, asking if President Trump felt misled by his national security advisors. Leavitt's response was immediate and harsh. Visibly frustrated, she snapped, "I have now been asked and answered this question 3 times by the both of you," refusing to allow a follow-up question and quickly calling on another reporter. This exchange was widely reported as a loss of composure that set the tone for what was to come. As the questioning continued, and it became clear that journalists weren't going to let the Signalgate issue drop, Leavitt made a decision that would define the briefing in public memory. After realizing most questions focused on the scandal, she abruptly ended the conference, citing a need to avoid counter-programming Vice President J.D. Vance's upcoming speech. She also mentioned Trump's scheduled appearances later that day, hastily adding, "Sorry it's a bit shorter today, guys," before making a quick exit from the podium. This premature departure was immediately characterized across social media platforms as her running away from difficult questions. One user on X wrote, "Karoline Leavitt got scared and just ran off the stage after getting grilled by reporters about the Signal chat." Another commented, "Karoline Leavitt practically ran out of that press conference after getting hammered by reporters." These sentiments framed her as unprepared and overwhelmed by the scrutiny she faced. The media response was equally unforgiving. Outlets like the Irish Star and the Mirror US described the event as a humiliation, emphasizing Leavitt's apparent inability to handle tough questions. Some forums even used harsh language, with users calling her a rat running away from danger and criticizing her for gaslighting the public about the leaked plans. Perhaps most damaging to Leavitt's credibility was her insistence that the leaked messages were not war plans, but merely attack plans, a distinction that many viewed as meaningless semantic wordplay. Critics, including the Mirror US, pointed out that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had posted a timeline of the bombing in the chat, directly contradicting her attempts to downplay the severity of the leak. The fallout continued days later. On April 1st, 2025, Leavitt provided what many considered an inadequate update on Signalgate, stating, "This case has been closed here at the White House as far as we are concerned, and that unspecified steps had been taken to prevent future leaks." This vague response only fueled further criticism, with commentators on social media labeling her the resident minister of propaganda for what they perceived as a transparent attempt to sweep a serious national security concern under the rug. The incidents we've explored thus far paint a picture of a press secretary under siege, struggling to maintain control of the narrative amid a major scandal. But the story doesn't end here. In fact, it gets considerably more complicated as Leavitt faced additional controversies in subsequent briefings. How did she handle accusations about spreading misinformation? What happened when she was confronted about controversial immigration policies? And did she manage to recover from her initial stumbles, or did the situation continue to deteriorate? The unraveling. The aftermath of the Signalgate debacle created a challenging environment for Leavitt, with journalists now more determined than ever to hold the administration accountable. Rather than adopting a more measured approach, however, Leavitt doubled down on her combative style, leading to several memorable confrontations that quickly went viral. One particularly notable incident occurred on April 15, 2025, when Leavitt faced questions about the deportation of Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia, a Salvadoran immigrant with protected legal status. Instead of addressing the legitimate concerns about this case, Leavitt responded with mockery, saying, "Based on the sensationalism of many of the people in this room, you would think we deported a candidate for Father of the Year." This dismissive comment might have been provocative enough on its own, but Leavitt went further, accusing Garcia of human trafficking without providing any evidence to support this serious allegation. This claim immediately drew backlash from advocacy groups and legal experts, with social media users like at Call to Activism describing her statements as a full-blown meltdown of lies. The situation deteriorated further the following day. On April 16, 2025, in what observers described as bizarre behavior, Leavitt initially asked if reporters had questions, but then refused to take any, leading to perceptions that she was tired and defeated. One ex-user, at Lippy Addiction, suggested she was at her breaking point, a sentiment that gained traction as video clips of the awkward moments circulated online. What made these incidents particularly damaging was the growing perception that Leavitt wasn't just struggling under pressure, but actively engaging in deliberate deliberate misinformation. Posts on X accused her of using planted stooges in the press room to field softball questions, a claim that gained credibility when the New York Times published an analysis highlighting her reliance on friendly media outlets. Critics described this tactic as authoritarian, with one social media comment stating, "This is how authoritarian states are run." The controversies weren't limited to immigration and media management. Leavitt's handling of economic policy, particularly regarding tariffs, also became a flashpoint. In a Fox News appearance that quickly went viral, she made claims about international trade negotiations that left even the typically friendly Fox hosts visibly confused. In this remarkable exchange, Leavitt attempted to clarify the administration's tariff policy, but instead created more confusion with contradictory statements. The Fox News host directly asked about the timetable for reducing tariffs against China, noting that Trump had been ambiguous about it.
Let me be clear, there will be no unilateral reduction in tariffs against China. The president has made it clear China needs to make a deal with the United States of America, and we are optimistic that will happen.
What made this exchange particularly noteworthy was Leavitt's circular logic, claiming to provide clarity while essentially restating the same ambiguous position that prompted the question in the first place. The Fox host's tepid response, "Okay, well, markets seem to be watching every bit of it," reflected the growing sense that even media outlets typically friendly to the administration were finding it difficult to extract straightforward answers from the press secretary. But perhaps the most eyebrow-raising moment came when Leavitt made an astonishing claim about the number of countries engaged in trade negotiations with the United States.
Too long. And President Trump has brought hundreds of countries now from around the world to the negotiating table. We have 18 proposals on paper from nations around the world who recognize that they have in fact been ripping off the United States.
This statement was immediately flagged by fact checkers as mathematically impossible, given that there are only 195 countries in the world recognized by the United Nations, 193 member states plus 2 non-member observer states. Even accounting for territories or autonomous regions, the claim of hundreds of countries engaging in negotiations was simply not credible. The accuracy issues extended to other policy areas as well. When questioned about immigration statistics during a briefing, Leavitt provided figures that seemed to lack any firm basis in official data.
Well, you'd have to ask the Department of Homeland Security for a specific number, but we suspect it's definitely in the millions, perhaps upwards of 20 million people that were allowed into the country illegally by the previous administration. And the president and his team are focused on deporting as many as we possibly can, and they are moving as quickly as possible.
When pressed to provide specific numbers on how many undocumented immigrants were in the country, Leavitt first deflected by saying, "You'd have to ask the Department of Homeland Security," but then immediately offered a speculative figure of perhaps upwards of 20 million people, a number significantly higher than most credible estimates. This pattern of deflection, followed by unsubstantiated claims, became a hallmark of her briefing style, leaving journalists and viewers alike questioning the reliability of the information being presented. The cumulative effect of these missteps was a growing crisis of credibility. Even conservative media outlets, which had initially celebrated Leavitt's appointment as a breath of fresh air, began to express concerns about her handling of basic facts. Her youth, once touted as an advantage that brought energy and fresh perspective to the role, was increasingly cited as a liability, with critics questioning whether she had the experience necessary to navigate the complexities of White House communications. Adding to the pressure was Leavitt's implementation of controversial changes to press room protocols. In a move that drew sharp criticism from media organizations, she announced that the White House would take control of the briefing room seating chart, stripping the White House Correspondents Association of its traditional role in this process. This decision, which appeared designed to favor pro-Trump and digital-first outlets over legacy media like CNN and NBC, was characterized by critics as a calculated effort to humiliate and sideline traditional journalism. Leavitt defended the change by stating, "It's not about ideology, it's about increasing the wide array of outlets that have access." But many viewed this explanation with skepticism, especially given her previous comments disparaging legacy media. The controversy intensified when it was reported that certain outlets, including the Associated Press, had been barred from the press pool for reportedly ignoring Trump's executive order renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. These structural changes, combined with her confrontational rhetoric and factual inconsistencies, created what many observers described as a perfect storm. Rather than fulfilling the traditional role of the press secretary to serve as a bridge between the administration and the public through the media, Leavitt seemed to be constructing walls, limiting access to those deemed friendly while alienating outlets with larger audiences and established journalistic credentials. The situation reached a new level of absurdity on April 17, 2025, when Chinese envoy Zhang Zhisheng pointed out on social media that the red dress with lace that Leavitt wore during a press briefing was made in China, a deeply ironic twist given the administration's tough rhetoric on Chinese imports and tariffs. Weibo posts from Chinese textile workers claiming to have produced the dress in Mabu, China, went viral, with Zhang stating, "Accusing China is business, buying China is life." This fashion faux pas, while seemingly trivial compared to policy matters, became emblematic for critics of what they perceived as the administration's hypocritical stance on trade. As these controversies accumulated, the pressure on Leavitt intensified. Her responses became increasingly defensive, and her body language during briefings suggested growing discomfort. The young press secretary, who had once been lauded for her confidence and poise, now appeared at times to be struggling to maintain her composure in the face of relentless questioning. Yet the worst was still to come. Soon, a series of dramatic incidents pushed the situation from bad to catastrophic, culminating in what many political observers now describe as one of the most disastrous periods for White House communications in recent memory. The question was no longer whether Leavitt could recover her footing, but rather how much more damage would be done before a change of course became inevitable. The aftermath. The combination of the Signalgate debacle, her confrontational media strategy, and the growing list of factual inaccuracies had created a perfect storm of credibility issues. But rather than a course correction, what followed was a series of incidents that further undermined her standing and transformed what might have been salvageable missteps into what many now view as an unmitigated disaster. On April 19, 2025, in what should have been a routine ceremony, Leavitt abruptly ended a briefing due to a medical emergency during Dr. Mehmet Oz's swearing in as administrator for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Witnesses described her shouting "press out" to evacuate reporters, a moment characterized as panicked by media outlets. While this response may have been appropriate given the circumstances, the optics of yet another prematurely terminated briefing reinforced the narrative of a press secretary struggling to maintain control. The following week brought no respite. On April 22, 2025, Leavitt found herself defending Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth amid reports of dismissed Pentagon officials leaking against him. When asked directly if President Trump still had confidence in Hegseth despite the controversies, she responded with unequivocal support.
No travel plans at this time. Doesn't mean it's not happening. I just don't have anything to share. But the president, of course, is aware of the passing of the Pope and did put out a statement this morning. And we're praying for the millions of Christians around the world who love the Pope and admired him this morning. The president absolutely has confidence in Secretary Hegseth. I spoke to him about it this morning, and he stands strongly behind him.
This expression of support was followed by more detailed comments when a reporter pressed her on her claim that the entire Pentagon is working against Secretary Hegseth, despite the fact that the fired officials were Hegseth's own appointees.
They were Pentagon employees who leaked against their boss to news agencies in this room, and it's been clear since day one from this administration that we are not going to tolerate individuals who leak to the mainstream media, particularly when it comes to sensitive information. And the Secretary of Defense is doing a tremendous job, and he is bringing monumental change to the Pentagon.
Her characterization of the fired officials as disloyal leakers contradicted reports that they were part of Hegseth's inner circle, raising questions about her grasp of the situation or willingness to present an accurate picture. More troubling was her blanket dismissal of leaks to the mainstream media as inherently problematic, regardless of the substance or public interest in the information being revealed. This stance on leaks appeared particularly hypocritical given the administration's own challenges with information security, as exemplified by the Signalgate scandal. Leavitt's attempt to frame media reporting based on such leaks as a smear campaign further strained her relationship with journalists who viewed their work as essential accountability reporting. The controversy over Leavitt's handling of press briefings extended beyond specific policy issues to encompass broader concerns about the administration's media strategy. A New York Times analysis claimed she relied on planted stooges in the press room to field softball questions, enabling her to push administration talking points with minimal scrutiny. While this characterization may have been overblown, there were legitimate questions about the systematic favoring of sympathetic outlets and the marginalization of those perceived as critical. Leavitt's personal style also became a subject of discussion. Her practice of praying with staff before briefings, reported by the Washington Post, sparked controversy when social media users characterized it as a vile PR stunt, a criticism that supporters viewed as an unfair attack on her sincere religious expression. This incident highlighted how even aspects of Leavitt's personal approach to the job had become politicized in the intensely partisan environment of Washington. The cumulative effect of these controversies was a press secretary increasingly viewed through polarized lenses. Supporters, particularly on conservative platforms like Fox News News and accounts like Vigilant Fox on X praised her for shattering media narratives and standing firm against what they perceived as hostile questioning. Critics, meanwhile, saw a propagandist who prioritized loyalty to Trump over factual accuracy and transparent communication with the American public. This division was evident in the contrasting ways her performance was characterized. To her supporters, Leavitt was a bold defender of Trump's agenda who refused to be intimidated by a biased press corps. To her critics, she was unprofessional, evasive, and increasingly overwhelmed by the demands of a job for which she lacked the necessary experience. The reality, as is often the case, was more nuanced than either of these extreme characterizations. Leavitt's youth and relative inexperience were undoubtedly factors in her struggles, but many of the issues stemmed from deliberate strategic choices rather than simple mistakes. The decision to prioritize new media over traditional outlets, the confrontational approach to questioning, and the willingness to make statements without solid factual grounding all reflected a specific vision of how the White House should engage with the press, one that prioritized message discipline and base mobilization over broad public information. This approach had historical precedents in previous administrations, particularly during Trump's first term, when press secretaries like Sean Spicer and Kayleigh McEnany often adopted similarly combative stances toward the media. What distinguished Leavitt's tenure, however, was the intensity and frequency of the confrontations, as well as the backdrop of specific controversies like Signalgate that demanded more nuanced handling. The aftermath of these tumultuous weeks was predictable, a significant erosion of Leavitt's credibility with large segments of the media and public. Even outlets that had initially been supportive began to express reservations about her approach, concerned that the constant controversies were overshadowing the administration's policy agenda. The question of whether she could effectively serve as the public face of the White House became a topic of open speculation. Particularly damaging was the perception that Leavitt was not merely struggling, but actively misleading the public. Her unsubstantiated claim about hundreds of countries engaging in trade negotiations, her unsupported accusation that Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia was involved in human trafficking, and her insistence that the Signalgate messages did not constitute war plans, all contributed to a growing sense that factual accuracy was not a priority in her communications strategy. This approach had real-world consequences beyond the political sphere. Markets reacted to her confusing statements on tariff policies, with investors struggling to discern the administration's actual intentions. International allies and adversaries alike found it difficult to interpret the administration's positions when they were presented in such contradictory terms, and ordinary Americans seeking clear information about government policies were left with more questions than answers after many of her briefings. It's worth noting that Leavitt's struggles occurred against a backdrop of significant policy challenges. The administration was grappling with complex issues related to immigration, trade, national security, and economic policy, all areas where clear, consistent communication was essential. The controversy surrounding her briefing style and factual accuracy made it more difficult to effectively convey the administration's approach to these crucial matters. Some critics have argued that Leavitt's difficulties were symptomatic of broader issues within the administration, a preference for loyalty over expertise, a reflexive hostility toward traditional media, and a willingness to sacrifice factual precision for political advantage. Others have suggested that she was hampered by impossible expectations, tasked with defending controversial policies in a media environment that was predominantly skeptical, if not openly hostile. What's clear is that the series of press briefings we've examined represented a significant failure of political communication, regardless of one's ideological perspective. Even viewed in the most charitable light, these events did not achieve their presumed objective of effectively conveying the administration's positions and priorities to the American public. Instead, they became the story themselves, distracting from, rather than highlighting the work of the government. What is beyond dispute is that these press briefings marked a significant moment in the evolving relationship between the White House and the media, a relationship that remains essential to the functioning of American democracy, regardless of the administration in power or the individuals who represent it to the public. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, be sure to check out the cards popping up on your screen.